Founded by Roger Williams in 1638, the congregation of the First Baptist Church in America welcomes you to the historic meeting house. Roger Williams risked his life and that of his wife Mary crossing the North Atlantic in January 1631. The Lion, the ship on which they sailed, was bound for Boston on a mercy mission with food for the starving settlers. Why embark on such a dangerous voyage? Roger's motive was simple. Had he stayed in England, he would have been arrested because of his religious views. William's religious outlook originated within the Puritan wing of the Church of England. Puritanism had appeared in the 1580s. Its followers wished to purify all remaining Roman Catholic practices from within the English Church. Some Puritans went further and concluded that the Church of England was beyond purification, so they withdrew entirely. They were called separatists, and Roger Williams came from that tradition. Most people today are familiar with the separatists who came to America in 1620, the Pilgrims of Plymouth. King Charles I, who ruled from 1625 to 1648, viewed the Puritans as enemies of both church and state and sought to stamp out the Puritan movement. An Act of Parliament of 1629 had given Massachusetts Bay Colony permission to govern itself. In this context, the Great Migration to America began, consisting of Puritans and other dissenters escaping religious and political oppression. In the spring of 1630, John Winthrop and about 1,000 other Puritans set sail and eventually settled in Boston. Winthrop established a commonwealth where he expected everyone to conform to its rules. When Roger Williams arrived in Boston in February 1631, he confronted Winthrop's Commonwealth, in which the Ten Commandments were enforced by secular authorities. Williams could not accept this practice because he felt that the first four commandments applied only to God and man. For him, government should never involve itself in such matters. After several months and false starts, the Williamses made their way to Plymouth, where Roger worked as a farmer. He originally considered becoming a missionary to the Indians, so he learned their language, traded with them, and studied their customs. After 2 years in Plymouth, Williams and family moved to Salem. Settled there, he fully revealed in his writings how much he differed from the Massachusetts way. He denied that government had any role to play in religious matters. He criticized the colony's charter, which took land from the native people without compensation, and he denounced the assertion that King Charles was a Christian monarch. For these ideas, he was put on trial, convicted of sedition and heresy, and ordered to be banished to England. Williams was granted a few weeks to get his affairs in order, but he fell gravely ill. The court showed leniency toward him and allowed him to recuperate on the condition he cease agitation. The court then discovered that he was receiving guests in his home and sharing his heretical beliefs. It sent a sheriff in January 1636 to arrest him. Warned in advance, Roger fled into the deep snow of an extremely cold winter and made his way to the headwaters of Narragansett Bay. Fortunately, he encountered Indians who sheltered and fed him as he made his way south. He spent the rest of the winter in the camp of the Sachem Massasoit and the Wampanoags. In the spring, he began farming in present-day East Providence with his family and some followers. But he received word that Plymouth authorities were being pressured by Boston to arrest him. Williams then crossed the Seekonk River into Narragansett Territory. where he acquired land from the chief sachems, Canonicus and Myantonomi. He thanked God for his deliverance and called his settlement Providence, because he felt that God's providence had brought him there safely. He declared that Providence would be a haven for those distressed of conscience. Providence was the first place in history where religion and citizenship were separated. Williams was not the first to call for liberty of conscience, but he was the first to provide an actual place where it would happen. About a year later, Anne Hutchinson founded Portsmouth and John Clark Newport. Both had left Massachusetts Bay under less than ideal circumstances. The island on which the two settlements lay, aquidneck to the natives, was referred to as Rhode Island by the English settlers. The idea of liberty of conscience was regarded with horror by the neighboring colonies, and they spent the next 100 years trying to extinguish what became known as Rhode Island and Providence plantations. They thought it would be impossible to have a civil government without a state church and religion. Roger Williams' colony was denounced as the sewer of New England, the hive of heretics, Rogues Island, and the licentious republic. The settlers arriving in Williams' colony had various religious views which came to influence him. The most noteworthy was that Roger Williams concluded that believers' baptism, not infant baptism, was the only scripturally valid baptism. He and families with whom he had been worshiping were subsequently baptized in the Providence River, founding what is now the First Baptist Church of America in 1638. A few months later, Williams experienced a crisis of faith where he decided that there was no authentic Christian church. So he left his fledgling congregation, although he remained friends with its members and continued to be as good a Christian as he could. He remained deeply engaged in the governance of his colony, and he established a trading post near present-day Wickford, trading with the nearby Narragansetts. Unlike other merchants, he would not trade in guns and liquor. After the other New England colonies formed a military alliance in 1643 and excluded the Narragansett Bay towns, Roger went to England to get a charter for his colony. He arrived in London to witness the early throes of the English Civil War between King Charles I and the Parliament. Roger had friends among the parliamentarians and eventually secured a charter from them, the Parliamentary Patent of 1644. While in England, he published his first book, A Key to the Language of the Americas, an English Narragansett dictionary, which also contained commentary about native practices and social organization. Having obtained his sought-after charter, he sailed for home, just as his great defense of separation of church and state was published. The bloody tenet of persecution denounced all forms of state religion, and so enraged the Parliament that it ordered the book to be burned by a public hangman. Williams returned to New England and spent the next 3 years guiding the political organization of his colony, whose settlements finally joined together in 1647. 4 years later, a power grab by William Coddington of Aquidneck threatened to split the colony in two. Providence, Warwick, Portsmouth, and Newport dispatched Roger Williams and John Clark to London to get Coddington's so-called charter revoked. England was now ruled by Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan general whose forces had defeated King Charles I in 1648. In 1653, Williams successfully obtained a reaffirmation of the 1644 parliamentary patent. He returned to Rhode Island, while John Clark remained in London working on behalf of the colony. In 1660, the Puritan Commonwealth ended, and Charles II was restored to the English throne. He declared all documents issued in the absence of the monarchy null and void. In 1663, John Clark secured a royal charter for the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. This was the first document issued under royal approval that provided for freedom of conscience. This document embodied Rogers' principal concern: no person shall be persecuted due to matters of conscience. What of the Baptist congregation that Roger Williams had founded? It persisted, but its history is somewhat scanty since no regular record-keeping occurred until 1755. From its founding, the congregation spun off daughter churches throughout New England and beyond. Meanwhile, in the mid-1700s, a great religious revival called the Great Awakening swept the colonies and enormously increased the number of Baptists in America. However, Baptists were regarded by most other denominations as ignorant fanatics, in part because almost none of their ministers had a college education. To remedy this problem, in 1764, the Philadelphia Baptist Association sent James Manning to found a college in Rhode Island. The college began in Warren, where Manning could have a pulpit, but was moved to Providence in 1770 after Providence won the bidding war with Newport to be its permanent home. After overseeing the construction of the college edifice, the new home of his college, Manning turned his efforts towards the Baptist congregation. The construction of the meeting house became Manning's next priority. This term, meeting house, needs some explanation. In New England, except for Rhode Island, colonies built meeting houses that combined the functions of a public town hall and a place of worship, supported by residents' taxes because of state churches. Please note a meeting house contemporary to Providence's, located in Rockingham, Vermont. Since Rhode Island had no state church because of Rogers' belief in the separation of church and state, such buildings had to be privately financed. Also, the term meeting house in the New England colonies referred to places where non-Church of England congregations worship. The word church for these individuals meant the body of worshipers, not the building. With respect to the Providence Meeting House, it was erected for public worship and to hold commencement because of its ties to the College of Rhode Island, which in 1804 became Brown University. But it also hosted public events, such as the town's observance of the death of George Washington. The Charitable Baptist Society, the business arm of the congregation, became incorporated in 1774 and then sought to raise funds, in part by lottery, to erect a meeting house. Land was bought along the present North Main Street, and construction began on June 3, 1774. Prior to that, the Providence Gazette ran announcements about the project and invited anyone interested in helping erect the meeting house to please show up. Many out-of-work shipwrights and carpenters from Boston traveled south to work at the site. Their unemployment stemmed from the British Navy's blockade of Boston Harbor in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, which had occurred in December 1773. During its construction, the meeting house was the largest building project underway in New England. In a year's time, the carpenters and volunteers managed to erect a building that could seat 1,200 people when the population of Providence was only 4,321. The most dramatic phase of the construction involved the raising of the steeple. Erected in a mere 3.5 days, the steeple made the meeting house unique in New England because it was the first Baptist meeting house to have a steeple and a bell. The steeple itself was a design taken from British architect James Gibbs' Book of Architecture, published in 1728. Its form was actually an alternate design for Gibbs' project, St. Martin's in the Fields in London. Aside from the dramatic steeple, the Providence Meeting House shared elements common to all New England meeting houses. It was square. It had clear glass, no stained glass allowed. It lacked iconography, not even a cross, which was regarded by Puritans as an idol. The main entrances were on the north and south side walls, not the tower entrance. It had a dominant pulpit placed against the east wall to emphasize preaching of the Word of God. It had large square box pews, which were owned or rented by the pew holders. Today, the sanctuary contained slip pews added in the 1830s. The first service was held in the meeting house on May 21, 1775. Exterior and interior finishing had to wait almost a decade after the American Revolution concluded. In 1792, the pews in the balcony were finished, and the Waterford chandelier, Gift of Hope Brown, was hung. Since that time, the meeting house doors have been open to thousands of worshipers, dignitaries, and visitors from around the world. It stands as a physical embodiment of Roger Williams' legacy of soul liberty and the tradition established in the United States of America of separation of church and state. What sort of artifacts and curiosities can be found as you tour the meeting house? Please note the following. On the exterior, the 185-foot wooden steeple is the only one in Rhode Island never knocked over in a hurricane. In the interior on the lower level, in the manning room, note the 18th century carpenter's hammer and the hand-pounded nails. The pew contract from 1778. The cannonballs from the American Revolution, the bar shot that looks like a barbell, a piece of naval munition to use instead of a cannonball against a wooden ship. Shot from a cannon, the bar shot would take on a twisting trajectory and tear the mast, the shrouds, or the sails of the ship, disabling it. Other artifacts include the fire buckets. There was no fire department at that time, and when one broke out, everyone joined a fire brigade to put it out. Your bucket would be returned to you at the end of the fire. Someone would list the names on all the fire buckets to keep a record, especially of those people who did not participate. A teapot sits in that room, a gift from the Roger Williams Family Association, which ostensibly belonged to Williams. In the hallway by the cloakroom, note the sketch of the properties of Providence families who were the original members of the congregation. In the foyer by the front door, note the chalkboard with the outline of the slip pews installed in the 1830s. Until the early 1930s, members owned their pews. Their name would be inscribed on the chalkboard accordingly, and when visitors came, they could tell which pews were open to them. In the interior sanctuary level, as you ascend the staircase, note the long-handled collection plates which date from the 18th century. In the sanctuary itself, the design represents an example of Georgian architecture, the classical style associated with Great Britain. There are no symbols of Christianity in the room, revealing the Protestant Calvinist tradition of no icons in the worship space. The columns were solid oak trees at one time, which the carpenters hewed into the Doric style. The column in the southwest corner shows how man cannot always tame nature. The east wall contains the high pulpit and the reading bench. Behind the high pulpit is the baptistry, and above it is the sounding board, an 18th century version of a public address system. The Waterford chandelier was originally lighted with candles, then gas, and now electricity. Please spend as much time as you wish touring this historic treasure and enjoy your visit.